So you're familiar with the company Lionsgate, right?
I guess. I've seen some of their movies.
Yeah. Did you know they have a theme park?
No.
Yeah, based on their movies.
In the US?
No, it's in China.
Okay. That's even weirder. I don't know. What do you know about it?
I looked up a little bit, and the thing that really cracked me up was there's a Gods of Egypt roller coaster. And we've both seen that movie, and it's just the worst thing ever.
Yes.
I think this whole theme park is just some executive getting their rocks off.
Yeah. I mean, and I know in China they like the big dumb CGI movies for whatever reason. So, I don't know. I'm sure they probably look at story differently, and maybe they can't tell how bad the acting is when it's not Chinese acting.
Maybe.
But that's still really weird.
So for this roller coaster, it's not just a roller coaster. When you get on the ride, on the train, you put on a VR headset, and as the roller coaster travels, you are within the Gods of Egypt movie, so you're like flying around in Egypt.
I mean, that's a cool idea, but maybe not for a Gods of Egypt ride.
There's no maybe about it. Why would you waste an idea like that on Gods of Egypt?
Yeah, but I'm surprised I've never heard of something like that before. That is a cool idea.
Yeah, it kind of takes what are those things called? The simulation.
Yeah, because I mean, if you're on a roller coaster too, you're flying around a lot faster and you can actually feel the wind whipping at you and stuff.
Yeah.
I could see some really cool stuff being done with that.
Yeah, I wonder if that's been done elsewhere.
I could see like a following Spider-Man swinging through the city kind of thing, fighting somebody. I don't know. There's a ton of stuff you could do with that.
Well, I just thought I would share that nugget of information with you. So now you have a travel destination for 2024. So what did you check out this month?
I watched a show called Jury Duty, which was from 2023. Have you heard of this?
Is that the one with James Marsden?
Yes. So the idea is you have a fake documentary being made about the jury experience, and there's one person that doesn't realize that the whole thing is staged. One person that's not an actor. And James Marsden plays himself, but a really douchebaggy version of himself, which was great. So the entire thing revolves around the real person's reactions to everything. It's only 6 episodes, I think. I would definitely recommend it. It was really funny. I really only have 3 they're not negatives, but criticisms, I guess. There is one episode that has some, I don't know, I'm not a fan of sex-oriented humor. And there's one episode that goes way farther than I expected it to in that direction. And it was funny, and it would have been even funnier in that situation, if I was the actor that was there and didn't realize it was all fake. But it was a bit too much. It seemed like it didn't fit with everything else. And it's not a complaint, but there are times when, since it's supposed to look like a fake documentary, you cut to some of the actors kind of just being interviewed or stuff like that. And since they're not real and the entire thing revolves around the reactions of the real person, it felt a little bit pointless. It was still funny, but it was kind of like, that's not what this is about. That's not why I'm watching it. So get away from that and go back to the guy. And the third criticism is I think it would have been a lot better if they had more than one person that was not in on it. And that would have made it a lot harder for them to control. And they would have had to, I'm sure, ad-lib a lot more and kind of maybe change things along the way, which I can see how that would be very difficult to do. But I think it would have worked a lot better if there were at least 2 people that were not actors, maybe even 3. I could see that working out a lot better, and they would probably get more material than just 6 episodes, but I would still definitely recommend it to people. It was a Freevee original, and I didn't know what the hell Freevee was. I watched it on Prime, but it turns out Freevee is another Amazon streaming thing. I guess it used to be IMDb Pro or whatever the hell that was.
IMDb
TV.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I don't know. It seems kind of ridiculous that they bought IMDb, they kept the streaming thing, they turned it into something else, but then they still have Prime. But then you can watch the things that are on that on Prime. So, I don't know. I watched seasons 2 and 3 of the Mighty Boosh, which were from 2005 and 2007. I talked about season 1 probably last month. I still liked it. Really over-the-top, surreal, wacky stuff. much more so than season 1. I liked season 1 the most because it felt a bit more grounded. That one was taking place in a zoo where the two main guys were working in the zoo, and you had kind of more in the way of recurring characters, and it felt a little bit more, this is going to sound stupid for people who have seen it, but it felt a little bit more realistic, and that's what I liked about it, I think. Once you get into season 2, they kind of throw all that out the window, and it's just, we're going to do whatever crazy stuff. You do still have a lot of recurring characters, many of which are played by the same main actors, but each episode is just kind of its own thing, and it's you still kind of have the background idea of they're working in a store, but I don't even know exactly what they sell. They seem to sell just a bunch of random stuff, and I don't know. I mean, it's clear that that they didn't think about that too much because it doesn't matter. But I don't know. I wish there was a little more to it. It's kind of like how Family Guy, and I hate that I'm bringing up Family Guy, but for a while, Family Guy had a little bit more in the way of focused storylines, and then it got canceled. And then when they brought it back and let Seth MacFarlane do whatever he wanted, it was just whatever random crap he wanted to do at the time, whatever random, if you can call it a thought, whatever random thought was going through his head. And it sucked. This is definitely better than that, but I wish it was a little more focused. And I also don't like the moon. Randomly through each episode, you'll get just the moon that has a face on it, and it talks. And it's hard to tell what the hell it's saying in the first place, but even with subtitles on, I just don't find it that funny. I don't know. So I still definitely enjoyed it. After watching that, I watched the Mighty Boosh live from 2006, which was longer than I expected. It was, I mean, I guess it would make sense if you're going to pay tickets to see something like this. It was a little over 2 hours, very funny, more of the same kind of stuff. Lots of, I mean, the show already does a lot of fourth wall breaking stuff. I liked a lot of the references to things from the show. I loved that they had Balo as one of the characters who's a talking gorilla. He becomes one of the main characters starting with season 2, but he was there as a recurring character in season 1. But even there, I think in season 1, it was only one of the characters that could hear him, that had a connection to animals or something. But starting on season 2, it's just, oh, there's a talking gorilla that kind of lives here. But some of that stuff was great. Yeah, if you like the show, I would recommend checking that out. I watched War of the God Monsters, which was a Korean movie from 1985. Apparently the Korean title actually translates to The Undead Beast, and it's also known as The Flying Monster.
Well, those are all close enough.
Really, none of those titles accurately describe the movie. I think War of the God Monsters comes closest. This was a really terrible movie. So there's this scientist, if you can call him that, who believes that dinosaurs are being revived by global warming, and they're going to launch an attack on civilization for some reason. And everybody thinks he's crazy. He kind of lives out by himself with his daughter, out kind of away from everybody else. And just, I don't know what his research is. He just kind of wanders around outside, I guess, looking for evidence of dinosaurs being alive. And the thing is, he says, like, nobody believes him and everything, but he finds a giant egg. He can just show it to people. He finds a giant footprint that apparently was just recently made. He can show it to people. But it's also funny because it's one giant footprint in the middle of this beach. That, I mean, did it take one step and then somehow fly away? I don't know. So there's this reporter that is trying to get, I don't know, she's trying to get the inside story on him, even though apparently everybody already knows everything there is to know, and nobody believes him, so the whole story does not make any sense. But she kind of scams her way in and pretends to be their maid or something. I don't know, it was confusing and didn't make any sense anyway. A lot of the acting is really bad. There are some attempts at humor that are incredibly stupid. And by the time you get about halfway through, I was waiting for the monsters to show up, and they finally do. And almost all of the monster footage is taken from episodes of Ultraman, and it does not match at all the rest of the movie. They took some shots from I think a Chinese movie where they got the aspect ratio completely wrong, so they kind of squunched it down into I think 3:4 from widescreen. There was one part of the movie where there's this weird, so these are just supposed to be dinosaurs that are coming back to life or whatever, but there's this one that's like breathing fire and shooting missiles out of its hands, and I was wondering how the hell that was supposed to be real, but then it turns out it's a little girl dreaming. But then later there are weird monsters that pop, because again, they're Ultraman monsters mostly, so they're shooting beams and lightning and fire everywhere, and I don't know. So I don't know if that was supposed to be a dream or if she saw it and then passed out and then nobody knew it actually happened. It's funny because you get a decent ways into the movie and people are saying, oh, I saw this monster and whatever, and other people don't believe them, but the monster attacked a city and blew everything up and killed a bunch of people. Just turn on the TV and look at the news and you'll have your proof. And then the way the movie ends, I think they kill... There's one monster that kind of dies by itself, I guess. There's another monster that they actually kill. But then there are still all these other ones rampaging around. But the movie acts like it has a happy ending somehow, or like things are resolved, but they couldn't actually show them die because in Ultraman they got killed by Ultraman. So obviously they can't stick that in there. But I guess the guy, I don't know, the scam reporter who was a total bitch through the whole movie, she rescues the guy's daughter, and then the daughter tries to convince them that they should get married or something, and it's like a happy ending at the end. I don't know, it was so dumb. Something else that was funny was, since they're using footage from another show where characters are talking and stuff and there's music, they had to cut all the audio out and replace it, and I guess they they needed to do some work on that, because whenever buildings are getting destroyed, it literally sounds like somebody's got like some pots and pans that they're just banging around, and that's supposed to be the sound of buildings falling apart. And the sounds for the monsters, there was one monster where it seemed like they forgot to put some of the audio out, because as soon as it comes on screen, most of the audio just kind of disappears. The sound that the monster is supposed to be making, it sounds like just a kid that's kind of laughing, and they just kind of like lowered the pitch or something. So that was weird.
So what you're saying is years later, they hired that person to do the trailer for The Mummy.
And there's one that's like a bipedal triceratops with elephant ears that they just used a bunch of chimp noises. At so many points in this movie, it was unintentionally funny because of how badly it was put together. So if you're like me and you're obsessed with monsters, just go watch Ultraman. Don't watch this. You're going to see all the same footage. This was terrible. And it was mostly pretty boring on the first half. I actually started this a couple months ago and completely forgot about it until yesterday. And where I started yesterday was about the halfway point, and that's where the monsters finally show up. I watched a movie called Blind Fury from 1989. Have you heard of this? With Rutger Hauer?
I've seen a poster.
Okay, so this is basically a remake of a Zatoichi movie, but with Rutger Hauer as Zatoichi. So the movie starts out with Rutger Hauer in Vietnam. I thought his helicopter had gotten shot down, and that's what caused him to lose his sight. But it turns out later that he was already blind by that point, I guess. So I don't know. Maybe the helicopter was just there. But he gets rescued by some Vietnamese that teach him how to get around while he's blind. And for some reason, they also teach him how to sword fight. And this is all within the first 5 minutes of the movie. So there's no explanation for anything. I don't know why they thought that would be a useful skill for a blind guy, but it turns out that it actually is. And just after that 5 minutes, he's just back in the US and going to find his friend, who it turns out has gotten involved with some mob dealings or something in Las Vegas. So he's gone, but he finds his wife and son, and the son is a little bitch. He is the most annoying piece of shit that I could imagine. I was really hoping he would die. Unfortunately, the movie's pretty predictable, so he ends up becoming friends with, I don't remember what Rutger Hauer's character's name was, so I'm just going to say Zatoichi. He becomes friends with Zatoichi. His mom is played by Meg Foster, and she gets killed right at the beginning of the movie by the guys that are... It doesn't make any sense, because as I'm thinking about it, they're going there because they're looking for the dad, who's played by Terry O'Quinn. So there's some big names in this movie, or at least some recognizable actors, maybe not big names. But they already have him over there in Las Vegas or whatever, so I don't know. As I'm thinking about it, it doesn't make sense. But they kill Meg Foster, so then Zatoichi takes the son, and they go to Las Vegas to rescue the dad or something, and that's the movie. It was entertaining at first. I thought I was actually going to like it, but then things started getting stupid once the kid showed up. And not just because of the kid. That's just kind of where things started getting bad. And I would say it's a bad movie. It was still entertaining at times. I would almost recommend it because I feel like it's a movie that you have to see to really get what it's like, because it's so strange. Some of it was legitimately kind of cool. Rutger Hauer does a decent job. He looks like Ellen DeGeneres in this movie, which was also kind of distracting. He's got the same haircut and everything. He does a decent job of acting like he's blind and swinging a sword around and stuff. Like, it doesn't look stupid or anything. The guy from Ninja Assassin that when he came on screen, you said, like, oh, that guy looks like he's probably been in a bunch of ninja movies or whatever. He's in this movie. At one point, the main bad guy, or one of them, says, like, get me Bruce Lee. We need somebody to fight this guy. And obviously, for the audience, it's supposed to be funny, but in the movie, it's really stupid that he would say that, because then somebody else is like, Bruce Lee's dead. And he's like, well, get me somebody else. So then they get this random Japanese guy with a sword. The apocalyptic biker guy from Raising Arizona was in here. You had Kempek in there. So again, some recognizable faces, but not a good movie. It was really stupid, but just entertaining enough and weird enough, unique enough, that I don't know. I'm still on the fence about recommending it, so I don't know. If you want to check it out, check it out. I watched The Haunting of Hill House, the Netflix show from 2018, which was 10 episodes, a complete story. I talked about how much I disliked the Edgar Allan Poe one, which was the same creators. When this one started, I was very disappointed because it felt like the same thing again. A lot of the same actors, the same basic concept of following a family through the years, where each character is played by multiple different actors, and even kind of the same structure where you'll have an episode focusing on one character at a time. And I really hated that Poe one, so I really didn't want to watch another thing like that. But I stuck with it, and it turned out to be much, much better. I did think this one was pretty good overall. Just like the Poe one, it has pretty much nothing to do with the source material. And if anything, I would say the things that they incorporated from the Shirley Jackson book made the show worse, because they felt a little too forced, just like with the Poe one, where you'd have quotes from the stories or people reciting poems that just feels like it doesn't fit. In here, it felt like some of those references, they kind of said, like, let's stick in some references here. And they felt like references. They didn't feel organic to the show. Thankfully, there were not nearly as many of them as there were with the Poe stuff, but I still wish that wasn't in there. I wish they had just done their own original thing. I think it would have been better, because it really has nothing to do with the book. So you've got this family growing up in this house, or, well, they're not growing up in the house, but they come to the house. I think they're gonna renovate it or something and then sell it. And as adults, they're all dealing with kind of their experiences in that house as kids in different ways. Some of them are somewhat traumatized. Some of them kind of try to deny that anything weird happened. And their mother died in that house when they moved out. Basically, they kind of moved out at the same time that she got left behind and she died. And it's haunted. There's ghosts. The last episode kind of tries to explain things, and that's what I was kind of waiting for, but I ended up not liking that last episode. I thought it was much better when it focused on the characters and their own personal struggles and journeys, and once you got to that last episode, you didn't really have that focus anymore, and it was more about the house. But I will be honest, I did not understand a lot of what the hell was going on in that last episode. I also was not paying as close of attention because it just wasn't as interesting. So I thought it had a disappointing ending. The first episode, something that also put me off at the start, was some of the acting was really bad. The guy that plays the writer, I think his name was Steven in the show, he was really bad in that first episode. He gets better later, but I still didn't think he was great. And the woman that he's interviewing in that first episode was also really bad. There's a lot of kid actors in this show, and that can go, in different directions. It's really hard to get good kid acting, because you have to have a kid that knows what they're doing, you have to have a director that knows how to direct them, and you have to have writers that know how to write dialogue that works for kids of that age and for those specific characters. And in here, I thought it mostly worked. Some of the kids were definitely better than others. I thought some of them were not very good. The girl that played the little girl from Megan was in here, and she was not great, but she wasn't terrible either. There was one that really stood out. McKenna Grace, apparently she was in the new Ghostbusters, which is probably still not going to make me watch it, but she was really good. I was really impressed. But she's really the only one that stood out as being especially good. And honestly, I wish they had given more for her to do, because she really only has a lot in the one episode that's focusing on that character. But she was great. I thought it was good overall, but I wouldn't particularly recommend it, just because I feel like I would rather have spent my time watching something else instead of putting 10 hours into this show. It was good while it lasted, and that last episode being so disappointing really left a bad taste in my mouth when it was done. So I would rather have watched something else. I'm definitely not going to watch the Bly Manor one. I talked about wanting to watch it after I read The Turn of the Screw, but knowing that it's not going to have anything to do with the source material, there's even less reason for me to watch it, so I'm just not going to bother. So, I get why some people really like this one in particular, although I'm honestly kind of surprised at some of the people that like it that much, because I wouldn't think they would stick with something like this. But it was good. I just didn't think it was great. I didn't think it was good enough to be worth the investment. And that's everything I watched. I read Horrorstör by Grady Hendrix, which was a book from 2014. So Grady Hendrix is a pretty popular horror writer right now, and I've always wanted to check one of his books out because they always seem unique and kind of self-aware. He definitely is very much influenced by 80s comedic horror movies. His books seem to have kind of almost like a meta element to them. And this is also the guy that co-wrote that book about importing kung fu movies, These Fists Break Bricks.
Yeah, I like that book a lot.
Yeah, me too. Unfortunately, I did not like this book. So the idea here is you've got workers at a store that's basically an IKEA ripoff, and they even refer to it as that in the book. Some of them stay overnight, and it turns out the building is haunted, and weird stuff starts happening. So the first half of the book was setting up the characters, kind of giving you their personalities and everything. And then halfway through, it takes a hard shift into horror, where most of the humor completely goes away, and it gets pretty extreme. There's like people getting tortured, and I don't know. It didn't fit at all with the first half. And the first half already was not anywhere near as interesting as the author clearly intended it to be. It feels like it's trying to coast on just the concept and expecting you to find that entertaining and funny enough to keep you going. But there just wasn't much actual humor in the book. There were a few moments that were funny, and it does seem like the author had a retail background of some kind. It seemed like he knew what he was talking about. And the horror side of it, it turns out the building used to be, I don't know if the building itself used to be a prison, or there used to be a prison on that piece of ground. A bunch of people died there, so now it's, haunted. And it's like the ghosts of the prisoners are trying to force the people to become prisoners or something like that, and the warden is kind of saying, like, you people need to be punished and whatever. But once you get into that second half, again, the first half was not entertaining in the way that it was supposed to be. It was mildly amusing at best. There weren't enough actual jokes. It was just that you're supposed to find it funny by default. But then once you get into the second half, it feels like mostly just random horror ideas being thrown in there. Almost like he watched Poltergeist and said, there's a bunch of random stuff in that movie, but that movie's actually cool, and you have, an actual storyline with characters and stuff. This book felt like just the characters were the most basic empty shells of actual characters, and the only one that actually had a character arc, I guess you could maybe argue for the main character, but the only one that actually had kind of a character arc besides her was the one character that I didn't expect to have any kind of character arc. Because the other ones, it felt like you could kind of see what he was gonna do with those characters. But then they mostly just disappear, and they all kind of get separated. And then the one character that I didn't think he would do anything with is the one that he kind of tries to do something with. But it doesn't, they're just not interesting. Nothing that's happening is especially interesting. I ended up being mostly kind of bored. And it's not that long of a book, but it felt like it was way longer than it needed to be, even with how long it was. It just didn't have that much to it. And again, looking at the book as a physical object, it feels like it was all about the concept and not about the actual content. Because the book is presented almost as like a catalog where you're going to kind of shop for items at this store. Each chapter has kind of, at the start of it, like a different item that they're selling. And that item tends to kind of pop up in that chapter too. So it really felt just kind of gimmicky. There really wasn't anything else to it. So I was very disappointed. At this point, I'm not interested in reading any of his other fiction books. If anyone out there has read this one and felt the same way that I did, and you read another one that you actually liked, let me know. Maybe that would make me want to check it out, because I do like the concepts behind them, and it seems like, I don't know, it seems like he's trying to have fun with it. It just wasn't that fun. It was kind of boring. So yeah, I would say skip it. I read The Gunslinger by Stephen King, which was the first book in the Dark Tower series.
So does that mean you're going to read all of them?
Not yet. I read this for a book club.
Okay.
It was from 1982, at least the book version, because it was originally 5 short stories. This used to be my favorite Stephen King book. It doesn't feel like a typical Stephen King book, especially at the beginning.
Not at all. And even compared to the second book.
Yeah, the very first section out of the 5 is the longest section, and that's the one where the writing feels the most different. And reading it now, that's where the writing felt the weakest. It really felt like he was trying really hard to achieve a different feel than, obviously, than his normal stuff, but also different than what he is really comfortable with. It felt like he was trying too hard. And there's also a lot in the way of Western tropes in that first section, and he kind of gets away from that and just lets it be its own thing after that, which is where it gets better. So the idea is you have this mysterious gunslinger that is pursuing this mysterious man in black who is some kind of evil sorcerer across this desert that seems to resemble the American Southwest. And the gunslinger is basically Clint Eastwood. And along the way, he encounters obstacles set in his path by the man in black. I still liked it. Again, once it got past that first section, it got a lot better. I think part of why it gets better, besides the change in the writing, is he meets Jake, who is a kid, he's maybe like 11, I think, from our world, who is mysteriously located in this world. And he doesn't know how he got there. He doesn't really remember a lot, but part of what makes it interesting is the personalities between the two of them kind of interacting with each other and how different they are. And I really like the world building because you don't have, it's not the kind of fantasy setup where you kind of get the background for everything and what the different, I don't know, people are that occupy this world, and kind of, you don't even really know what it's about. You just kind of get into it and start reading it. And you kind of get little hints that the Gunslinger's world used to be like ours, but seems to be in the future where things have kind of, civilization maybe kind of collapsed. It's almost like a Mad Max kind of situation like that. But there's also something going on with the laws of reality, with the laws of space and time, where they're kind of not working the way they're supposed to. It's hard for people to tell how long has passed between different events and even how long distances are and stuff like that. And it seems that the Gunslinger's job is to fix that somehow, and chasing the man in black is the first step on that journey. So it is a cool book. It's pretty short, especially for a Stephen King book.
But it's also the first in a series of 8.
Yeah, or 7.5, depending on how you look at it. So from there, I did go on to the second one, The Drawing of the Three, which was from 1987. So this book involves the gunslinger, Roland, gathering people for his quest, basically. And he doesn't completely understand why he's doing what he's doing or what he's even doing. He keeps talking about being guided by Ka, which is kind of like fate or destiny.
Yeah, I was going to say it's all Ka. Why are you questioning it?
Yeah, which did feel like kind of a lazy Stephen King thing of, well, I don't know what this is going to be yet, so I'll just kind of like just throw in some kind of thing like that. And there's a lot of the Stephen King thing of kind of like mystical connections between people and things that are just kind of there just because. Like, for example, Roland in both of these books, he talks about how much he loves the other people that he's with, but sometimes he just met them, and it's like he had such deep love for this other person and whatever. And it's like, okay. I think it would work a lot better if that felt like it developed a little more naturally. And I especially, in the second one, there was a part that made me laugh, where another character, Roland, he's crying because he knows that he might end up sacrificing these people to achieve his goals, and this other character kisses him on the cheek, and I was like, oh, give me a break. It was a little too much, but I think now I like this second book more than the first one.
The second one definitely has a straighter narrative than the first one.
Yeah, and it feels a lot more like a typical Stephen King book in good ways and bad ways. On the bad side, you do get a lot of the bad Stephen King dialogue, but on the good side, it doesn't feel like he's trying as hard. It feels like he's more confident in what he's doing. And it also, I think part of what makes it good is, and part of what makes it feel like it has a strong sense of momentum, is it's not the typical Stephen King thing of he doesn't know where the story's going to go. In this one, it feels like he has specific goalposts that the characters are moving toward and that he as a writer is moving toward. So it feels like the book itself is going somewhere, even if you still don't really have a lot of information about the larger story, the larger series of what's, the larger scope of things. But basically, he's traveling along this beach, reaching these weird doors that are just kind of hanging there in the air that are invisible if you look at them from behind, and they open up into our world, into people that exist in our world. So he's kind of in their heads.
He's John Malkovich.
Yeah, people brought that up at the discussion we had for it.
The worst of the Stephen King monsters.
And again, the the clashing of personalities between Roland and these other people is a big part of what made it entertaining. It really draws you in and just makes you want to see what's going to happen with these characters, even if you don't really know where the larger story is going. I do wish that the other characters had kind of stopped Roland a little bit and said, hey, how about you explain a little bit more? Because they kind of go along with things a little too quickly, or at least Eddie does. He's the first character that shows up. From having read the third book before, I know at the beginning, pretty early on in the third book is where you finally get a little bit more explanation. But just for the characters, it doesn't feel plausible that they're kind of just going along with things without more explanation earlier on. And there is still conflict. They still fight Roland a lot. But yeah, it's a really entertaining book, I would say. And I really like the way it starts, because there's a certain event at the very beginning of the book that comes out of nowhere, but in a realistic way. It's almost like the way you can have just an accident that changes your life that you're not expecting. It's not an accident per se in the book, but something happens that changes Roland and is going to affect him going forward. And I thought it was a really good way to start the book, because it's completely unexpected, has nothing to do with anything else that's going on, but in a way that feels like something that might actually happen.
I really like this series in general. This is probably one of my favorite series, and part of it is the creativity and innovation that Stephen King allows himself to use, because he's not constrained by one world's set of rules.
Yeah, and I know this doesn't really come up in the first couple books, or even really in the third one, but this series kind of connects the larger Stephen King universe of most of his other books. From what I understand, his newer books, a lot of them take place in kind of their own other universe that is not connected to any of this stuff. I don't have experience with that myself, but that's what people tell me.
I mean, if he needs some help with that, all he has to do is talk to DC, because they've been dealing with a very organized multiverse for decades.
Yeah, they never have to reset things at all. So I would definitely, having only read the first three, I remember liking the third one less than the first two, but liking the stuff at the end of the third one a lot. And talking to other people that say they really like the third one, they're usually talking about the stuff at the end.
I think once the main characters feel comfortable enough with each other and really start to explore this world, that's where it really takes off.
So having only read those first three, I would still say they're worth checking out. I would recommend.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I've been playing Skyrim. That's all I've had time for. I haven't played it that much. So getting ready for moving to Japan and trying to take care of stuff at work and everything, I haven't had as much time to do a lot of stuff. So that's everything I did this month. What did you check out?
Okay, we're going to start with a really good one. I watched Cats from 2019.
Of course you did. I should have expected this.
This movie already has a reputation and has been covered extensively by everybody across the internet. But as we all know, you and I are typically behind on new stuff.
Correct.
But I finally mustered up the courage to sit through this movie, and I have some thoughts, which I'm going to share with you now. For anyone who is not aware, it's a movie version of the musical Cats, but in this movie version, all of the actors are CGI'd as cats. They look like humans in cat costumes, but they spent millions of dollars making them CGI'd instead of just giving them costumes. It looks terrible, and it was a terrible decision. And they're still human-looking, but in the movie, they're not supposed to be human-sized. They're supposed to be cat-sized, so proportionally, their surroundings are very large. They jump on big cars, they sneak through cracks in doors, stuff like that. But the ratio seems to vary throughout the movie to match whatever action the filmmakers needed at that moment, so it's even more jarring than it would be if it stayed consistent. And there's one song where there are a bunch of mice, who are also people CGI'd as mice, and they're smaller than the people CGI'd as cats, and those size ratios are really inaccurate too. And then there's also people CGI'd as cockroaches, who are even smaller. And when all the CGI characters are in the same frame, I mean, I'll tell you, for spending millions of dollars on the production of this film, the compositing for those shots is on the same level as King Kong versus Godzilla from '62, where the humans are fighting that giant squid.
It's a giant octopus, but okay.
There's even a part where James Corden, who is also in this movie, if you need another reason not to watch it, turns directly to the camera and mocks how creepy and not like actual cats all of the actors look. Their faces are probably the most unsettling part. Judi Dench's face and Idris Elba strutting around naked as a cat were particularly disconcerting.
Okay.
There was an interview where the actor said they spent hours upon hours walking around on all fours and learning how to move like cats. Which is pretty much how they move throughout the entire movie, and it looks awkward. And that's not to say these people aren't graceful and fluid. Many of them are incredible dancers that are very flexible, very lithe, but the fact remains that humans do not naturally slink around on all fours because they are not cats. I've never seen the stage show, and I imagine it also has people slinking around, but not in the same style as this movie. I think the layers upon layers of digital effects make it look really unnatural. Do you remember in Alice in Wonderland, the Tim Burton one, when Crispin Glover was lurching around?
I have not seen that one, but I have heard about how weird Crispin Glover looked.
Yeah, he's supposed to be really tall and just walking, but they CGI'd him to be taller, so it looks really, really awkward. And this movie reminded me of that. And this is originally a musical on a stage, but if you're transferring a production to a different medium with different staging possibilities, you should really consider taking advantage of that. This movie chose not to do that, but at the same time was fighting to keep you as the viewer from seeing it as a fixed set on a single stage by using wild editing and grotesque computer-generated set pieces. It was like they're trying to pinch pennies with one hand, but simultaneously spend millions with the other hand. It made me think of that Sweeney Todd movie from 2007, and that movie had some CGI too, but only in a few parts, and they really stood out because it looked so bad. The rest of that movie was actual sets built with physical objects and rooms laid out to shoot movie scenes and gave people costumes and props and direction. Cats had everyone gather daily on an open stage with green walls, stick dots all over their bodies and faces, and reenact the Green Man routine. Spending more money does not equal more success, which movie studios continue to refuse admitting to this day, despite producing all of these box office bombs. And I notice they usually shift the blame to the public for not spending more money on their movie.
Yeah, they'll say whatever the hell they want to.
Using denial as a defense mechanism. And apparently, the visual effects department for Cats was ground down to the bone to get this movie out, and the director didn't actually understand what they did and how they did it. So he kept making these really outlandish demands and expecting immediate results. And when the movie came out in theaters, some of the effects were still not finished. So the studio sent out replacement copies after the movie had already come out. And I don't know which version is streaming on Netflix, but it was hard to tell what was supposed to be finished because it all just looked so bad. And the actual plot of the musical, which I was not familiar with before watching this movie, is in itself something that feels like it was done as a joke bet. A bunch of cats are having a cat fashion show, and different cats sing songs about why they deserve to win the cat fashion show. That's it.
Oh, man.
That's the story of this huge movie that cost $100 million. Oh, and some of the cats inexplicably have the ability to perform magic. Not illusions, but magic. And to someone who would counter, you know what, you're simplifying the movie too much. There's deeper messages within the narrative that you're totally missing. You are wrong. And I'll tell you why, because I did some reading up on this. The songs in this musical are actually standalone poems by T.S. Eliot about cats performing tricks. And Andrew Lloyd Webber took those poems and set them to music as a songwriting exercise. There's no overarching narrative within the poems. The people behind the musical came up with the story to connect them at the last minute, after they had already sold tickets to the show.
Wow.
As far as the characters and acting go in the movie, it's not good. The main character, who is the new cat, being introduced to all these other cats, has the same expression on her face the entire time. I would describe it as wondrous hesitation. There's this big push by the studio to have this movie become a cult classic and follow the lead of the musical. But the musical came out in 1981. It was a very novel and unprecedented thing. That's what got people talking about it. But nowadays, there is so much media that big, momentous movies, even the ones that are actually good, quickly become yesterday's news because we're always being pushed towards the next thing, even within those movies themselves. I cannot tell you how many times I've talked to someone who went to see a movie, tell me it was terrible, it was the worst thing they had ever seen, But they were so excited to see the next one that was teased post-credits.
Oh, yeah. I hear people say stuff like that, too, and it just confuses me, baffles me.
The 1981 musical popularized the equivalent of a blockbuster film, where a bunch of flashy, audience-pleasing pageants of sights and sounds are thrown at you in rapid succession to keep you entertained until it ends in a big, huge flashbang climax. And at the same time, it waters everything down and makes it bland enough that it can be presented to as global an audience as possible. The end goal being, make as much money as we can without actually having to create a meaningful product. It's just an accessible spectacle. The musical was just this huge, in-your-face, overwhelming extravaganza, and that's what stuck with people because it had never been done before. And it became part of the formula for everything after it. It was also the first musical that heavily invested in merchandise being part of the revenue, and it just lowered the bar across the board. But the joke was on the movie makers this time, because for movies, we hit that point way before 2019. There are no positives about this movie. People point to the song that Taylor Swift wrote specifically for this movie, and she's in the movie, but it was just another song. It did not redeem the movie, and it's not even something worth watching to see how bad it is. You're better off spending your time doing pretty much anything else.
Well, I'm sure you'll be looking forward to Cats 2.
I watched Shazam from 2019. And this was one of DC's attempts to copy the Marvel movie trend and be self-aware about superheroes existing and stick in a bunch of humor. So there's a lot of silly jokes and awkward situations. Captain Marvel was created by Fawcett Comics way back in the 40s, and he was competing with Superman over at DC. And it actually started to outsell Superman, so DC said, well, we're just going to sue Fawcett for copyright infringement of Superman. And Fawcett had already been sued previously by DC for another Superman clone. But because it wasn't making that much money, Fawcett just said, okay, and stopped making that comic. But since Captain Marvel was making a lot of money, Fawcett didn't want to do the same thing, so they fought back. And DC came to court with a bunch of evidence that Captain Marvel directly copied stuff Superman had already done, and Fawcett countered with the fact that Superman was already copying stuff that Captain Marvel had already done. It was great. And in the end, Fawcett partially won in that even though Captain Marvel was infringing on Superman's copyright, DC had abandoned Superman's copyright, so there was nothing they could do about it. And DC appealed, and they pushed back, and it was concluded that only some Superman stuff had abandoned its copyright. So the whole thing was dragged back into court, and at this point, Fawcett felt it wasn't worth it to fight DC again, and they weren't making as much money anymore. So they paid DC a bunch of money to settle, and then they fired their entire comic book department. So a happy ending for everybody. And then in the 60s, Superman comics were booming again, but part of the settlement stated that Fawcett couldn't publish Captain Marvel stuff, period. So they didn't. But in the 70s, DC decided they wanted to use the Captain Marvel character, so they licensed him from Fawcett. But since Marvel, the company, had created their own Captain Marvel, DC could not use the name Captain Marvel. So they slapped Shazam all over everything instead, even though the character was actually called Captain Marvel.
Yeah, they couldn't put Captain Marvel on the covers.
Right.
And they couldn't advertise him as Captain Marvel, I think.
Right. And they even brought in some of the people who used to work at Fawcett in on the new Captain Marvel stories. But since part of the licensing meant DC had to pay Fawcett a per-page licensing fee, they stopped including him as much because they just didn't want to pay that money. And they kept toying around with his character and stuff tied to him over the years, and he passed through a bunch of hands, and it seemed like everyone was a big fan of Captain Marvel, but DC was like, we don't really know what to do with him. And in the 90s, DC straight up bought the rights to everything Captain Marvel, so they didn't have to pay Fawcett anymore, but they still had to navigate around the Captain Marvel copyright that was owned by Marvel the company. So I guess to make things easier, around 2006, they just changed his name and started calling him Marvel, which I'm sure didn't present any challenges.
I didn't know about that. Okay.
And in the New 52, they finally just said, you know what? His name is Shazam, because that's just easier for everybody. And everyone's been calling him Shazam since the freaking 60s, so good.
I mean, on a similar point of ridiculousness on the Marvel side, the only reason they came up with their Captain Marvel was because the name was available. And then the only reason they really kept publishing Captain Marvel titles was because I think every 5 years they had to put something out or they would lose the copyright. So that's the only reason they kept putting stuff out.
So good. So the movie from 2019 is made from a realistic angle in that it focuses on real people who live in a world where superpowered beings exist. And when a kid gains superpowers, they approach it from that perspective because physically he's an adult, but mentally he's still a kid. And there's a lot of humor. For the most part, it works. Even though the narrative is seen through a regular person's eyes, the main characters don't feel like real people. The two main kids, Billy and Freddie, get the most character development, and the rest of them just kind of pop in when they need to. The acting was not great. Mark Strong, who's the main antagonist as Dr. Savannah, he was good, but that was about it. And I initially thought the wizard is actually named Shazam. I thought he was going to turn out to be a joke. It was Jaimin Unsu, but he's not old, and Shazam's supposed to be really old. So what they did was they made him look old, but it looked like a Halloween costume beard and hair. It looked fake. Like, I legit thought he was going to rip it off at some point and be faking it. It was so bad.
And I just looked up Mark Strong, and he's the guy that was the bad guy in Sinestro and Green Lantern.
Yeah. The kids felt like kids who are now in acting mode. They were trying, but not believable. I was watching the main kid thinking, man, he is acting like he's in a Disney Channel show. And then I found out he indeed got his start via a Disney Channel show. The humorous parts, like I said, were pretty good. But when it was just the kids for an extended period of time, my attention really started to drift. And it was a weird juxtaposition to clearly call out that this movie fit into the universe and events of Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, and Aquaman. I mean, Superman actually shows up at the end of the movie. And I know in the sequel, Wonder Woman is a huge part of the movie. Maybe not a huge part, but she actually shows up and has conversations and stuff. Overall, I think this one was worth watching once, but I wouldn't clear your schedule for it.
And I just realized all that talk of Captain Marvel, people that are only familiar with the current Captain Marvel will be even more confused because that's not either of the ones that we were talking about, the current female Captain Marvel, so that's a whole other thing. She used to be Ms. Marvel, but then now there's a different Ms. Marvel. So, yeah, I hate comic books sometimes.
I watched Eve of Destruction from 1991.
Okay. I'm pretty sure I watched it back in 1991, but I obviously don't remember anything from back then.
This is the movie about a scientist who creates a robot that looks like her, sounds like her, and has her implanted memories. And it is out for a field test when the bank that it's in gets robbed and she gets shot, and that triggers her to go into military mode, which means that she will explode in 48 hours. And for some reason, that explosion involves a nuclear bomb. I don't know if she is a nuclear-powered robot or just has a nuclear bomb in her. They never really explain that. But that's the kind of movie this is, where you just have to accept it and go.
Is this like a low-budget movie or like an actual like studio movie?
Oh, it's a low-budget movie. So to stop this robot, Eve, they call in Gregory Hines, who is this military badass whose specialty is taking out those who need to be taken out. And he works with the scientist to try and predict what Eve will do and where she'll go based on her implanted memories. And it is bad. It is a really bad movie. The writing is bad, the acting is bad, and even a surprise pop-in by Kevin McCarthy does not help this movie. I was pleading for any sort of tap dance routine, but I didn't get anything, so this movie truly has no redeeming qualities. I felt bad for Hines. You could tell he was trying to work with what he was given, but he was given a pile of garbage. So, like in the briefing, when everyone's being introduced to each other, the scientist says, "What are your qualifications? What's your specialty?" And he goes, "Well, to tell you the truth, my specialty is a spinach lasagna and a very light tomato and basil sauce." And I collapsed. I fainted just from how awful it was. And then when I woke up, I watched the rest of the movie. There are some explosions. There's a lot of robot Eve staring intensely at nobody for extended periods of time. And the whole ending sequence has her running around the city with this wailing child who's just screaming with this ear-piercing shriek for 20 minutes. And it wasn't annoying at all. And when Gregory Hines shot Eve, I was like, just, maybe she could drop the kid in the subway. Speaking of terrible things, I watched the first season of Super Friends, which aired 1973, 1974. And this was the first of many, many seasons of Super Friends that got all these different titles in an attempt to make it sound different enough. But I'll tell you, this season was really difficult to get through. Each episode was 45 minutes long, but they felt like they were 45 hours long.
45 minutes long? That's okay.
This is the epitome of Hanna-Barbera cheapness, and I'm not just talking about the animation errors. The writing is lazy, the acting is not good, and it just seems like an overall dislike of the show by the people who are making the show. I have never seen more of an effort to avoid writing and animating a scripted animated show. There are 16 episodes, and they aired these 16 episodes via reruns consistently for the next 4 years before they made any other episodes, which is just exhausting. And each 45-minute episode was one story. It was a super basic one-sentence story that they said, let's drag this out for 45 minutes. And it did not work. I think if somebody wanted to assassinate Miyazaki, not that anyone should ever want to, but if they did, all they would have to do is send him an episode of the first season of Super Friends, and he would just die. This season was smack dab in the middle of the safety censorship of the 70s, so that meant that everything had to be nice and moral. So the Super Friends don't fight villains in this season. They fight natural disasters or machines.
What?
And the villains behind everything aren't actually bad. They just didn't realize what they were doing was wrong, or they were doing it for reasons to help people, but didn't realize the consequence of their actions. But their plans are terrible. Okay, there's this one dude who decides that humanity sucks and is the cause of all problems on Earth. And, I'm not arguing with that. But his solution to the problem is to erase all history of everything man has ever done. And how does he do that? He comes up with a potion that makes things disappear, and he dumps it on all the libraries and museums because they hold all of our history. And then they stop him, and they're like, that's not a good idea. And he goes, I guess you're right. Thanks, Super Friends. So the only characters in this one are Batman, Robin, who are always referred to in pairs. So it's Batman and Robin, Superman, Wonder Woman, and Aquaman. And because this is Hanna-Barbera, there's a dog with that human intelligence and two dumb kids, because we got to appeal to those younger adult things. What, the children, I think they're called? And what better way to put in some annoying-ass, bad joke-making, useless pieces of shit at the Justice League table? It's making me angry just thinking about this first season. 16 hours of my life I will never get back. And I'm in the middle of season 2, which is called the all-new Super Friends Hour, which is also 45 minutes long, but it's split up into 4 small segments, which is a great move. And they get rid of those stupid kids and their dog. And villains actually show up. And some of them are existing DC villains. They're people who are doing bad things because they're bad. Plus, the animation is marginally better. It's still 70s Hanna-Barbera, but it's way better than that first season. And the voice cast expanded more too, which is great because I was tired of listening to Casey Kasem, Frank Welker, and Ted Knight have entire conversations with themselves for an hour. And just to be clear, the first season of this show is not bad because it's old or it's not dark or whatever. It's a bad show. If you made a checklist of the bare minimum things you needed to make a semi-competent show, the first season of Super Friends would not check any of those boxes. And the fact that it's DC characters has nothing to do with it. It's just the skin that's been slapped over this terrible skeleton of a show that's already missing half of its bones. Season 2, I'm enjoying so much more. I'll probably talk about that next month. It's actually entertaining, but skip this first season like the plague. I watched Tetsuo 2 Body Hammer from 1992, which is the sequel to Tetsuo the Iron Man, which is a very popular cult film. And you've seen the first one, right?
Correct.
Have you seen the second one?
No. I remember when you talked about the first one, I mentioned that I saw it so long ago that I don't really remember much, but I remember not really liking it.
I had never sought out the second one until now, and it was made 3 years after the first one. And while it had the same spirit, it was a much more conventional movie. The narrative got a stronger focus, the characters were more fleshed out, it felt like more beats of a story instead of kind of random things happening. And while things were still weird, they were much more grounded. It wasn't nearly as shocking as the first one was. The main actor is the same guy as the first one, he's just a different character. And through trauma, he transforms again into part machine, part man. But this time there's this whole cult of people that he's fighting against. And there are still innovative and memorable characters who are acting in that manic style. And the story does have twists and turns. But for someone who wasn't familiar with this type of movie or the first one, this one is much easier to follow. It's more of a movie, I guess, instead of an experiment, if that makes sense. And there was definitely more money involved, which you could see from every aspect of the production design. And it seemed like Tsukamoto was digging a little deeper into conventional aspects of filmmaking and storytelling, blending that with his weird art house stuff. And I liked it. I know there's a third one, but that was all the way in 2009, and I don't know anything about it, but my fear is that there's just crappy 2000s era CGI. I watched Mr. Bean, which was broadcast 1990 through 1995. I mean, you're familiar with Mr. Bean.
Yes.
And it's crazy that this entire show is only 15 episodes, because it always seemed a lot longer.
Yeah.
Maybe the fact that it was spread out over 5 years, and it's just been rerun so much, maybe that's what makes it seem longer. Mr. Bean is a classic, almost silent movie, humorous show. Rowan Atkinson plays Mr. Bean, who's an inept goofball who is single-minded, looking out for himself, and unaware of how his actions affect others, and he's pretty dumb. He's intrigued by simple things, and he thinks he's really clever when he creates solutions to problems, but his solutions are usually convoluted and cause more problems than they solve. It's a good show for all ages, I think, and the lack of dialogue gives it a very universal appeal, which was intentional. And I think Rowan Atkinson does such a good job, with such simple premises. How do you feel about it?
I agree. I think it's the kind of thing that if you watch just a few seconds of it, you're going to say, wow, this looks really dumb. But if you give it a chance, I think it's pretty funny.
I could do without the laugh track.
Yeah, that's always a bad thing, in my opinion.
I watched Bone Tomahawk from 2015. Have you seen this movie?
No, but I've heard of it, and it's been on my list.
Okay, I'm going to talk about this. I'm not going to give away too much, because I don't want to do that. This is a horror film set in the late 1800s American Old West, where Kurt Russell is the sheriff of a town, and it has some people kidnapped. So he and 3 others travel out to go rescue them. And it turns out that the Native Americans that kidnapped these people are inbred cannibals. So besides the urgency factor, there's the added danger that they now know about the town. And it's got a good cast. Besides Kurt Russell, you got Patrick Wilson, you got Richard Jenkins, and you got Jack from Lost. And it's a slow burn movie. I went in blind, and it really turned into something way more shocking than I was prepared for. I was not ready for the utter brutality of this movie, and someone kept recommending it to me, and I'd seen the poster, and I was like, oh, this looks like a Western. And this person likes Westerns, so that's why they're recommending it, but it was not what I was expecting. It's one of those movies where if you're talking to someone else who's seen it, all you have to do is say, dude, how about that one part where, and the other person will be like, yes, I know. And because of the shock factor, I don't really want to say much more about it. It is best to go in blind and also not have any children in the room or in your house when you watch it.
Okay, you're really hyping it up.
You have to get through enough of it, and then when things start to pick up, they really pick up. And it's such a small thing, too. It proves that a movie doesn't have to be this big grandiose thing to stick in your mind. So speaking of Westerns, I also watched Seraphim Falls from 2006.
I think I've heard the title, but I don't know anything about it.
It's a Western with Pierce Brosnan and Darkman, Liam Neeson.
That's the first thing you think of with Liam Neeson.
Yeah, I couldn't think of who it was, yeah. And it's a revenge movie set after the Civil War, where Liam Neeson is seeking out Pierce Brosnan across the wilderness of the frontier because there was an incident where he blames Pierce Brosnan for his family being killed. And the movie gets right into it. The opening scene is Pierce Brosnan running away and getting shot. And the backstory slowly makes itself known through flashbacks and minimal conversation. It wasn't a bad movie, but it was definitely trying to make itself seem bigger and deeper than it actually was. Both Pierce Brosnan and Liam Neeson run into people along the way through their whole journey, and these people provide different viewpoints and their own struggles, and then they're gone. It reminded me of Circle of Iron, which I talked about last year, especially near the ending, as reality and philosophical concepts start blending together. It was also interesting to watch these 2 Irish guys do their best to not be 2 Irish guys. I watched Ghosts of Mars from 2001. What a mistake. You've seen this, I assume.
I've seen parts of it. This used to be my brother's favorite movie. It probably still is.
Oh, man. This is a John Carpenter movie from 2001 that is very indicative of John Carpenter's career around this time. He's done low-budget stuff before, but it didn't matter because there was solid storytelling, there were compelling characters, and there was an overall feeling that everybody cared about what they were doing. And this movie had none of that. A group of soldiers is sent to a mining outpost on Mars to pick up a criminal, but when they get there, they run into a cult of miners who it turns out have unsealed a bunch of malevolent spirits who proceed to possess them and kill anyone who isn't possessed and turn the whole outpost into a wasteland. So when the soldiers arrive, no one is around and they have to figure out what happened. Everything is very predictable, not to mention the plot of doom. The characters are typical sci-fi channel characters and their acting matches that. The criminal they're going to get is played by Ice Cube in all of his stellar acting, and the main soldier is played by Natasha Henstridge in all of her stellar acting. The only person who had a fighting chance was Pam Grier, but she died in the first 10 minutes, which sucked. And the rest of the movie, you got to deal with Jason Statham relentlessly hitting on Henstridge, which is as awful as it sounds. If you really want to experience the movie in your mind, don't actually watch it. Imagine a bunch of people standing around saying boring things while they can't act, and then have them be attacked by a bunch of people with piercings, and it turns into a giant gunfight accompanied by the Doom soundtrack, and that happens over and over and over again until the movie's over. So because I watched Super Friends, I also decided to watch Justice League, which aired from 2001 to 2004. And this was near the tail end of the DC animated universe, so things were well established in terms of storytelling and style. And this is a good show. It definitely picks up as the show goes on, and I think part of that is because there were so many more story opportunities with such a big cast and directions to go. And it's interesting that every episode is a 2 or 3-parter. It has good character development, and one of the things I really like about the DC animated universe in general is how continuity heavy it is, and this show is no exception. Good takes on classic stories, good takes on new stories, and then I followed that up with Justice League Unlimited, which went until 2006. And this one took Justice League in a more cool direction, in a less dignified direction, if that makes sense.
But not in a bad way like that sounds.
No, it was really good. It was much lighter and the humor was more present, but it was all handled very well. And the episodes are more standalone, but the continuity is still just as strong. It seemed like everybody felt very comfortable expanding outside of the main league members, which was in contrast to how Justice League started, because it felt like they were hesitant about doing that. And I read somewhere that they stopped doing the show because they didn't have any more ideas. And I don't really believe that. I think it was more a case of not having any more overarching plot threads that could be carried through another season, and that's why they stopped. And I would have liked to see more, but I'm glad they quit while they were ahead.
I agree.
And I really like that intro. I know you talked about TNG, how you can sit through that intro every time.
Yeah.
Which I do too, but this is another show where I'll sit through it every time. Unlike that Justice League intro, which has not aged well.
Yeah.
And the voice acting for the DC animated universe has always been so good. Almost every actor is a good choice for the character they voice, and there are a few outliers. I think Robert Picardo as Amazo was a terrible decision, but that's like 1 in 100. It was so cool to watch an episode and hear a character talk and say, oh, who is that? I know that voice. I just cannot place it. Yeah. And then you see it in the credits and you're like, oh, that's so cool. If you haven't watched either Justice League or Unlimited, I'd recommend them both.
As would I.
The people behind the show started with Batman the Animated Series, and they said, we are making the show for ourselves. We're not making it as a children's cartoon. And it carries through all the way through Unlimited, which is the last show. Speaking of DC things, I read Convergence.
Oh, geez. Okay.
Which was the end of DC's New 52 initiative in 2011. The New 52 was when DC said, everything is too complicated. There are too many things to keep track of. So we're going to kind of reboot everything. We're going to clean up this multiverse thing that's been going on forever. So character origins were retold, reimagined. It was kind of starting from scratch, right?
But in a really shitty way.
Yeah.
For the most part.
And that's what was supposed to happen. But in typical DC fashion, they decided to selectively keep some of what had happened, which resulted in a mess because the simultaneous message was that everything is starting from zero.
And they also didn't figure out what was in continuity beforehand.
Yeah.
They just kind of tried to figure it out as they went along, and of course that doesn't work.
And then even within this initiative, I think in 2013, they said, again, everything's going to start from number 1, but it's still the new 52. So you would have an issue that was like 16, but it would be 16.1.
That's what that was about? Okay.
I think so. I didn't really pay that much attention at the time because I didn't really care. If we are saying anything incorrect and somebody knows more about this, please correct us.
Yeah.
And in 2015, DC said that actually, that multiverse thing we tried to clean up, it didn't work. So now this whole New 52 continuity is going to join all of the existing really confusing stuff. So Convergence is that. So the plot, in quotes, is Brainiac has gathered a bunch of cities from all of these different universes. And he's pretty much omnipotent at this point. And he brings them to a single planet. And the planet is, in essence, alive. And when Brainiac doesn't come back, the planet decides, well, I guess Brainiac wanted all of these cities' inhabitants to fight each other to see who deserves to exist. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to keep smashing them into each other. That's the meat and potatoes of the end of the New 52. I mean, I'll tell you what happens. It's not a big deal. It's very expected. So at the end, Brainiac does come back. And they all determine that in order to stop the multiverse from collapsing in on itself again, they have to send some characters back to the original events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, and they have to change them, and they do. So now every possible universe and its characters and events exist simultaneously, so they can do whatever they want with anybody. So this massive company-wide effort to clean things up did the exact opposite of what it was supposed to do.
And I read this, and I don't even remember that being the plot, so it was terrible.
Yeah, it was just another regular DC story, despite being such a big deal continuity-wise. There was nothing new. And at the end of the whole thing, Brainiac's like, yeah, I guess I'm a good guy now.
I remember a big part of why I didn't like it, or why I thought it didn't work, is it didn't really focus on any characters as characters. It was just like, hey, look, this is the Batman from this universe, and hey, look, it's this guy, and they just all kind of just showed up.
I mean, Crisis on Infinite Earths also dealt with the multiverse thing, but it did it in such a good way. Like, it was a good story. And this led to the whole DC Rebirth thing, which I'm also not very familiar with. Do you know what's going on there? Is that what's happening right now?
No, that's ended now too, but it was much better than New 52. It was kind of DC saying we're going back to the previous continuity, basically. So even though Convergence did all that Convergence crap or whatever, it didn't really matter. It felt like a very kind of, let's throw something out there to kind of explain things a little bit, but not really, but you don't really have to read it. Rebirth was much better. The one bad thing going into Rebirth was when they were bringing in the Watchmen characters, which was a terrible idea from conception.
And it wasn't just them. Wasn't it all Vertigo stuff and Wildstorm and whatever?
I think Wildstorm was already part of it by that point. I think that happened during New 52 somewhere. But the thing is, Rebirth started good because, at least most of the titles that I read, because they all felt like they were going somewhere. They felt like they were part of a larger thing. They felt like there was a direction they were heading in. But then Doomsday Clock was the actual miniseries that was supposed to bring in the Watchmen characters, and it kept getting delayed. And by the time you got to the end of it, it was inconsistent with things that were already happening in the regular DC comics. And I think they kind of said, at the time, it was ambiguous as to whether it still actually was part of the same continuity or not. And I think they decided it wasn't, but I'm not 100% sure. But that was where the Rebirth titles started losing that momentum, because they kind of abandoned that plan that they had, the thing that they were all building toward. They just kind of said, well, we're not going to do that anymore. So that meant all these titles that had a direction they were going in were suddenly just kind of adrift. And that's what it felt like reading them.
That's lame.
Yeah, but the start of them, most of them were pretty good. In contrast to New 52, where I remember Wonder Woman was interesting, at least, because they turned it into a horror comic. It felt kind of like they were trying to do a Sandman kind of thing, the way Sandman was at the beginning, which was interesting. I don't know if I'd say it was good, but it was interesting. Other than that, I don't really remember liking any of the New 52 stuff. I know the Batman stuff was really popular, but I read that entire New 52 run, and I did not enjoy it. Although I did like when Commissioner Gordon, for some reason Batman is gone, so Commissioner Gordon puts on a freaking, I think it's like a mech Batman suit or something, and goes out and fights as Batman. I liked it for the stupidest, in the stupidest way possible.
I read Gwendy's Button Box from 2017, which is a novella that Stephen King started, then put away because he didn't have enough material. But then Richard Chizmar said, hey, do you want to do a story together? And Stephen King was like, here, check this out. And they ended up finishing it between the two of them. It is about a girl who's given a box with buttons on it, and she has to resist the temptation to mess with it, and she has to deal with what the box is and how it affects her life. And that's a really simple summary, but it's a very simple story. It's not a long read. It's not very deep. It was fine to knock out in one afternoon.
And that's the first of a trilogy.
Yeah, which Richard Chizmar wrote the second one himself, and then for the third one, they both came back again. And the only thing I played this month was Final Fantasy XVI, which is very much a narrative-based game. It was not what I was expecting at all. It is a story with many, many details, characters, and relationships. And one of the people behind it stated they were thinking of Game of Thrones at the time, and I believe it. There's legit a character who only exists to keep you up to date on what's going on in the world, with like maps and visuals and little moving pieces and everything. And she even says, don't interrupt me. And there's a historian with hundreds upon hundreds of entries for characters, places, lore. There are these massive character webs you can view for each major time point in the story. It has relationships between characters and even what they're thinking about other characters. The whole world is incredibly in-depth and really well written. From a gameplay perspective, it is extremely linear, but it succeeds because the narrative is strong enough. It is probably the most hands-off Final Fantasy game I've ever played. It felt like I was playing through a movie, but not in a bad way. There were a lot of side quests, and there were good things and bad things about them. The good thing was that it helped expand the world even more, and it gave even side characters a lot more depth. The bad thing was that most of them were running back and forth to relay information between people, and that got tiring really fast. Visually, the game is gorgeous. The environments are really detailed and expansive, and it was great to run around and explore, even though most of the time you were just heading in a straight line to get to where you needed to go. There's a lot of voice acting too, and it was actually pretty damn good. It was recorded in English and intended to be in English, so that was really interesting. I think you're the same way, leave games on their native language setting.
Right.
So it felt weird to play a Final Fantasy game in English. The only part where the story kind of failed was the main antagonist's plot and motivations. Final Fantasy has a decent track record of making the main threat feel like a main threat, but that level of threatness wasn't really reached here. Even the world-changing event around the halfway point, where in past games it was, I wiped out this continent, or the whole world has changed. In this game it was, the sky is really cloudy now. The main villain and his flunkies, their dialogue was really repetitive and such a letdown from what it seemed like the story was building up to. Even all these characters behind the scenes manipulating stuff, it turns out that they were just really lame and not really working towards anything secret. It was something you already knew. It is an action-based combat, so not typical turn-based Final Fantasy JRPG stuff. This game is Devil May Cry in terms of combat. They even brought in a dude from Capcom who worked on Devil May Cry, and they were like, please help us develop this system.
Okay, I'm intrigued by that.
And as you get further into the game, the combat styling and customization really opens up and is very satisfying. I was watching somebody else play, and their loadout was completely different than mine, but they both worked really well. But in contrast, the game is not hard. Even the hard mode in New Game Plus is not hard. It's kind of disappointing that once you establish your combat mechanics and your style, the game doesn't make you change it based on different enemy types or different bosses or anything. If you've got an effective style, it works on everybody.
Okay, that is disappointing to hear.
Yeah, I was bummed out. In terms of enemies, typically Final Fantasy games have a lot of enemies. This one did not, but it made up for it in having a lot of boss encounters and mini boss encounters. The enemy design was really cool. And they don't just kind of swing and punch at you and charge towards you. They all have unique attacks that really worked. It was very creative. And there are these huge battles between giant monsters, and you are one of the giant monsters. That's part of the plot point. Some people can turn into giant monsters. And for lack of a better word, and just thinking in my 12-year-old mindset, like, those battles were cool as f***. They're these huge spectacle cinematic fights that they just feel so good. And they were a big marketing point, and having played through the game twice, justifiably so. Because when I saw it at first in the advertisements, I was like, yeah, whatever. But actually doing it yourself, you're just like, yeah! And they're ridiculous. And you think it's over, but then it goes into the next phase, which is even more ridiculous. And then you go into space. And it's really cool. The music is good too. And something I really liked is that there are those mainstay Final Fantasy themes peppered throughout. But because of this story, some of the elements to a Final Fantasy story have been turned on their head. And the music reflects that. Like in past games, there's the big focus on the crystals, and the crystals are the embodiment of nature and goodness and whatever, and we got to protect them. But in this iteration, it turns out that the crystals are actually the cause of a lot of problems, and that has to be dealt with. It was an interesting take. Overall, it was a great game that could have been really great if it had just been tweaked a little bit more in some areas. And like I said, the combat, while being really customizable, was disappointing because you never had to change anything. It got repetitive. Part of that was this game was aiming to be accessible to everyone, even people who had not played a Final Fantasy or JRPG in general. But the extent they went through caused it to be watered down too much. But I think it was worth playing for sure. And that's everything I did this month.
All right, I definitely want to try out that Final Fantasy game then.
No, you definitely want to check out Cats.
I'll wait for the sequel, so they'll put them both out together on the same DVD. So that's January 2024.
Join us next month as we broadcast live from the Lionsgate amusement park in China. Lionsgate Entertainment World. In 2019, Lionsgate mentioned they expected the park to have around 1.5 million theme park guests in 2019 alone. The Hunger Games, Mockingjay Flight, Rebel Escape, The Twilight Saga, Midnight Ride, Gods of Egypt, Battle for Eternity, Escape Plan. I don't know, is that a movie?
I think that was a Sylvester Stallone movie. Yeah, it looks like Escape Plan, Sylvester Stallone, and Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Man, these people look like they're in a torture chamber.
The picture for that Twilight Midnight Ride is just people on motorcycles with VR headsets on.
I'm going to look at the Gods of Egypt one. High-tech virtual reality roller coaster experience.
As an epic battle wages between good and evil, it's time to prove your valor, strength, and devotion.
Expel the evil vampires wandering through the jungle. Why don't you give me a new experience, Lionsgate?
I mean, if I ever go to China, I'll try to check it out.
Okay, so I got a list of the movies. The Hunger Games, Twilight Saga, Now You See Me, Divergent, Gods of Egypt, Escape Plan, and La La Land.
I was working in a theater when Divergent came out. I saw enough of that to know that I definitely want to check it out. I think I might have even mentioned that before. It looks really, really bad, but I want to read the book first. I'm hoping we can still consistently put out one of these for each month, but with me going to Japan, it sounds like I might not have internet for a while, and I probably won't have much to talk about as far as stuff that I watch, because I'm assuming I won't have time.
So I'll be doing all of these solo. So you're going to have to deal with only shitty movies, because you're the one who watches the things that are actually good.
Sometimes. Because I am going to be trying to watch a lot of Japanese stuff to work on my Japanese.
I would recommend Final Fantasy 16.
Yeah, I definitely want to try that out.
Well, that was a joke, because it's in English.
Oh, well, okay.
So, we'll see what happens.
But either way, we want to keep putting more stuff out, so we're gonna do our best. It's just a little up in the air right now as to how that's actually gonna work.
Yep.